Hello everyone, welcome to Brainstorm Lore, and welcome to the final phase of the Targaryen conquest. When we last left off, Aegon and his sisters had successfully conquered 2 of the 7 kingdoms, and it was beginning to look like Aegon the Conqueror might in fact be able to live up to his epithet, and achieve his grandiose design of uniting Westeros under his rule. He had just concluded matters to his satisfaction in the Riverlands, and his good friend and hand of the king, Orys Baratheon, was settling affairs in the Stormlands. And then word came to him that the other kingdoms were on the move. Now, the news wasn't all bad. The Vale was busy putting down a rebellion by one of its own lords, the Ironborn were now fighting among themselves as to who would be their new leader, and the Dornish were doing little more than launching a few raids north of the Red Mountains. Meanwhile, though, Torrhen Stark was calling his banners in the north. More urgent for Aegon himself, though, was the news that the kings of the Reach and the Westerlands had made an alliance. King Mern Gardner and King Loren Lannister had agreed to combine their forces to drive out the invader, and they were heading in Aegon's direction with an army of 55,000 men. Once word of this combined army reached Aegon, he immediately sent word to recall his sisters and their dragons, and recruited as many of the Riverlanders as was willing to follow him to battle. The Riverlanders were certainly grateful to Aegon for getting rid of the Ironborn for them, but in the end Aegon was only able to muster a grand total of 11,000 men, most of it untried and untested. Needless to say, when both armies met in some wheat fields alongside the Gold Road, and the 2 kings learned of how small the Targaryen force was, they were utterly confident of victory. But Aegon was confident too, and this time he had his sister wives and their dragons in addition to his own. The day was hot, the grass was dry, and the wind was blowing towards the enemy. All Aegon had to do was wait until his force had engaged the combined armies of the Reach and the Rock, at which point all 3 dragons went aloft and set fire to all the grass that was downwind of the enemy, and then let the prevailing air currents do the rest. 4,000 men are said to have burned to death at the battle that became known as the Field of Fire. Another 1,000 died at the swords and spears of Aegon's forces, and 30,000 simply surrendered. By contrast, the Targaryens only lost 100 of their forces, and the only notable injury was Queen Visenya. King Loren Lannister managed to escape with his life, only to be caught a day later, at which point he promptly bent the knee. For that, he was allowed to keep his life and his titles, and became Lord of Casterly Rock and Warden of the West. Unfortunately, King Mern Gardner wasn't nearly so lucky. Not only did he die at the Field of Fire, but so did his sons, his grandsons, his brothers, and his brothers' sons. Which means that House Gardner, one of, if not the oldest ruling house in all of Westeros, was rendered extinct in a single day. Which meant that, as if in a repeat of the burning of Harrenhal, there was no one to bend the knee to Aegon. What's more, given that all the noble houses of the Reach claim at least some form of relation to House Gardner, it would not be hard for one of them to rally the others and continue to resist the Targaryen cause. In an effort to avoid this scenario, Aegon flew for Highgarden, the Gardners' traditional family seat, at the fastest speed that Balerion could manage and demanded to see the person in charge. That person turned out to be Harlan Tyrell, the Gardners' hereditary steward. Now, why did Aegon pick Tyrell to be his Warden of the South and Lord Paramount of the Mander? Why not one of the other families of the Reach, some of which arguably had stronger ties to the Gardners, and better claims to significance, like, say, the High Towers of Oldtown or the Florence? In my opinion, it's a simple question of Aegon putting Harlan Tyrell, and by extension all of his descendants, in debt not only to Aegon himself, but to his own family line. Just like with the Tullys, the elevation of Harlan Tyrell to Overlord of the Reach was an elevation rather than a demotion, as it would be with the other rulers who bent the knee to Aegon. And it was an elevation that, again like House Tully, House Tyrell would owe to the Targaryens. And it always pays to have someone in your debt. So, that was the Reach and the Westerlands settled to Aegon's satisfaction. 2 kingdoms for the price of 1 battle. Now to deal with the Northerners. Fortunately for Aegon, one of the perks of being a conqueror is that the more and bigger battles you win, the easier it is to get recruits. As a result, by the time the Targaryen and Northman armies were facing each other on either side of the Trident, Torrhen Stark found himself confronting an enemy that not only outnumbered him, but also had 3 dragons. By this point, word had reached Torrhen Stark of the burning of Harrenhal and the Field of Fire. Not exactly a sterling track record of successful resistance to Targaryen rule. Still, Northmen are a grim and stubborn bunch, and many of the northern lords insisted that they could still carry the day. Torrhen's own bastard brother, Brandon Snow, even offered to sneak into the Targaryen camp at night and poison Aegon's dragons. Instead, King Torrhen decided to treat with Aegon. Messages crossed the river back and forth for 3 days, and then, on the 3rd day, the king in the north crossed the Trident and knelt at the feet of Aegon the Conqueror. He rose as Lord of Winterfell and Warden of the North. Like most Starks, King Torrhen was first and foremost concerned with duty, his duty to his men and to the families that they had left behind to follow him to war. How many would have died if they had fought Aegon, even if they'd somehow managed to win? The casualties would have been immense. So many families would have been left bereft of fathers, husbands, and brothers. And yet, Westeros is a martial culture, a culture that values bravery in arms, and the fact that Torrhen is remembered as the king who knelt centuries later shows that the memory of future generations has not been kind to the last king in the north. At any rate, 5 kingdoms down, only 2 to go. Once again, Aegon and his sister wives went their separate ways. Aegon himself flew southward to Oldtown, the center of the Faith of the Seven. Visenya went east to take another crack at the Vale of Arryn, while Rhaenys went even further south to negotiate with the rulers of Dorne. By this time, Queen Regent Shara Arryn had successfully put down the rebellion that had sprung up against her after the Targaryens' first attempt at conquering the Vale. When word reached her that Visenya Targaryen was coming back for a second try, the Queen Regent rallied an army and set forth to reinforce the Bloody Gate, the famous bastion to the Vale of Arryn against which so many enemy armies had dashed themselves to no avail. Visenya, riding atop Vhagar, simply flew over those impregnable defenses as if they weren't even there. Shara Arryn hurried back to the Eyrie as quickly as she could, and when she got there, she found her son, Ronald Arryn, the future king of the Vale, sitting on Visenya Targaryen's lap in the courtyard, mere feet away from Vhagar, who, while not as large a dragon as Balerion, was certainly large enough to eat the boy without even having to swallow. Ronald Arryn, completely oblivious to the danger he was in, asked his mother if he could please ride the nice lady's dragon. The 2 queens exchanged some polite pleasantries, presumably a little forced on Shara's part, and Visenya ultimately agreed to take Ronald up for a quick flight 3 times around the Eyrie. By the time Vhagar descended back to the courtyard, Shara Arryn had gathered up the swords of her garrison and the falcon crown worn by the kings of the Vale since the Andal invasion. And so, House Arryn went from kings of the Vale to lords of the Vale and wardens of the East. 6 down, 1 to go. As for Rhaenys Targaryen, her own diplomatic mission proved to be less fruitful than her elder sister's. As Meraxes flew her over the plains and deserts of Dorne, she found the southernmost kingdom of Westeros strangely deserted. Every fortress was empty, every town had been abandoned, except for a few women and children and the elderly. Whenever she asked where all the fighting men had gone, they simply said, away. At last, she reached Sunspear, the seat of House Martell and capital of Dorne. It too was deserted, except for one lone occupant, Dorne's ruler, Princess Miriya Martell. Of course, we all know the famous dialogue that went on between the aged princess and the young queen. I will not fight you, nor will I kneel to you. Dorne has no king. Tell your brother that. I shall. But we will come again, princess, and next time we shall come with fire and blood. Your words. Ours are unbowed, unbent, unbroken. You may burn us, my lady, but you will not bend us, break us, or make us bow. This is Dorne. You are not wanted here. Return at your peril. As for Aegon, he was greeted at Old Town with open arms. As I said earlier, Old Town was the center of the Faith of the Seven, and the seat of the High Septon, essentially Westeros' Pope. After the Field of Fire, the High Septon had locked himself away and had fasted and prayed to his seven-faced god for 7 days and 7 nights. At last, the crone, the aspect of the seven that represents wisdom and guidance, showed him a vision of the future. If Old Town chose to resist Aegon, it would burn, as would hundreds of the faithful. And so, whether this was divine revelation indeed or simple common sense, the High Septon persuaded Lord Hightower, the secular ruler of Old Town, not to resist the conqueror. So Aegon arrived to find the gates open and Lord Hightower ready to offer his sword. 3 days later, Aegon was coronated for a second time. His first coronation had been a simple and peremptory affair, held at the wooden palisade of the Aegon fort back when he'd only had a dozen lords sworn to his service. Now, every single noble family and peasant from the Wall to the Red Mountains was ready to swear fealty to him and his line. Beneath the dome of the Starry Sept, the High Septon anointed Aegon with the 7 oils, placed a crown upon his head, and proclaimed him Aegon of House Targaryen, the first of his name, King of the Andals, the Rhoynar, and the First Men, Lord of the 7 Kingdoms, and Protector of the Realm. Mind you, Dorne was still unconquered, and there was the business of the Ironborn, but for all intents and purposes, Aegon had won. But claiming 7 kingdoms, well, technically 6 kingdoms, is one thing. Holding on to them, let alone ruling them, is another. And again, there was still the question of Dorne. Next week, the reign of Aegon I, with all its trials and tribulations from its beginning to its end. Until then. Thank you for watching. Please like, share, comment, subscribe, and check out our website at studiobrainstorm.net. And if you have a story that you think is worth telling, we are more than happy to help you publish it. Thank you, and have a nice day.